Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another 2028 election prediction. This time we're looking at the Democratic primary, and some things have changed. I am now including Kamala Harris as a candidate because she has decided not to run for California governor. I've also removed Cory Booker and Tim Walz as nominees because honestly, they're just polling so low that I don't think they'll be in the top 8 at the end of the day. Cory Booker, he's already rapidly declining. He was at 10%, now he's at 3.6, and with Harris being in this prediction, I think she's going to take his entire lane of support away from him. And Tim Walz, he also loses a lot of support with Harris running because take a look, polls without Harris, he's actually polling pretty well. He's at 9%. He's in the top 4. So is Cory Booker. He polls a lot better when Harris is out of this. But when Harris is included, he loses a lot of support. So those two really don't have a chance of winning, and they'll probably be early dropouts if they were to run. But this is who I think the top 8 will be. And for the primary schedule, we are mainly just going to go based off the 2024 Democratic primary schedule. Usually they keep that pretty similar, but there'll be some states that shift around, of course. So it's not always going to be 100% accurate which states vote and when. But yeah, we're just going to start off. New Hampshire is probably going to be the first state to do the primary. They don't care about delegates, so even if they go first and they don't get any delegates, they really don't care. They barely have any delegates to begin with. There's only 23 at stake. So I think they just want to keep that first in the nation primary status regardless. So I look at New Hampshire, and we got to see the latest New Hampshire poll. So far, Pete Buttigieg nationally, he's polling pretty well. So is Newsom. And I would also say AOC is polling pretty well too. She's going to be in the top 4 here. But we're going to take a look at polls for the statewide contests. So there we go. New Hampshire. So far, Pete Buttigieg has a decent lead here. AOC, I think, is actually polling lower for her support. I think she's going to do a lot better than this. And I don't think J.B. Pritzker is going to finish that well in this race. But let's get over to New Hampshire first. So I do think Pete Buttigieg would win this state. He came very close last time in 2020. He came pretty close to winning against Sanders. AOC, I think she gets second. Newsom, I think he gets third. Ties the amount of delegates AOC has. For these other candidates, they had to hit 15% of support to get some delegates. So I could see Harris probably getting to 13%. She is polling pretty well nationwide, but she's already polling pretty badly in New Hampshire. So maybe she does a little bit worse than that. Josh Shapiro, I think he would do decent here. I think he would get into 8%. J.B. Pritzker gets 1%, Whitmer 1%, or no, 4% each. So that's how I see they would all kind of perform out here. So Harris and Shapiro get third and fourth, or no, fourth and fifth. So the rest of these guys, they're not going to receive a delegate here. So even Shapiro and Harris, they're not getting a delegate. They need 15% of support in the state or in the congressional districts here to get, and they're probably not going to get it. So these remaining delegates, I'm going to each give them 2 here. They're definitely going to split them, and I think Pete Buttigieg gets a bonus delegate here. So Pete's off to a small lead in terms of delegates. The next state that would be voting is South Carolina, and I don't think Pete Buttigieg is going to do well here. He doesn't do well with black voters, so I don't think he's going to get any delegates out of this state. I think Harris, for sure, is going to win South Carolina. By how much? That has to be seen. Gavin Newsom, he's probably going to get second. He is trying to make a play to get the endorsement of, I believe, I'm trying to remember what his name was. But he's a very prominent South Carolina Jim Clyburn. Now I got it remembered in my head now. Jim Clyburn, he gave the endorsement to Biden all the way back then in 2020. It was a big reason why he won South Carolina by so much. I still think Clyburn would back Harris, but Newsom's trying to make a play to get the endorsement there. AOC will probably get in the 20-ish% support here. So these remaining delegates, I don't think they're going to go to any of these other candidates because I don't think they'll hit 15%. So then we go over to Nevada. Would any of these candidates drop out that have 0 delegates? I don't think Whitmer would drop out just yet. I don't think Shapiro would drop out. I could see J.B. Pritzker and Andy Beshear dropping out, because Andy Beshear, if he does poorly in a southern state, he's going to see what's the real point of staying in this race. So I think Beshear and Pritzker would both drop out after disappointing performances for them early on in these states. So then we head to Nevada. Nevada, I think AOC has a lead here. Let's see if they did any polling out of Nevada yet. No, they have not. But in Nevada, I think she'll do well with Latino voters. I think it's between her and Newsom that really wins this state. But I'd give AOC the edge here. Newsom gets in second. Pete Buttigieg and Harris, I think they each at least get to 15%. I think Pete Buttigieg gets around 19, but Harris is right off that South Carolina win, so I see her doing good in this state as well. Oh yeah, with J.B. Pritzker and Andy Beshear, I'm not really sure who they would endorse. I think Pritzker would probably endorse Newsom, and Beshear, I think he would just kind of not really endorse anyone yet. But let's head over to Michigan. This is Gretchen Whitmer's home state. She needs to win this state to have a chance here. However, we got to look at the national polls, because we don't really have a poll for Michigan quite yet. And Pete Buttigieg, this is his home state as well. But according to the polls, Pete Buttigieg has a pretty big lead, and Whitmer is usually only at 2% in the national polls. So I'm inclined to believe Pete Buttigieg would have to be a narrow favorite to beat Whitmer in our own home state in this primary. So with Whitmer polling so low nationally and not doing well in the early contest, I could see Pete Buttigieg narrowly beating her in the state of Michigan. Whitmer, of course, would be in second. But I think Pete Buttigieg narrowly beats her in the home state of her. The rest of these candidates, I think AOC would at least get to 15%. And I don't think Harris or Newsom would hit that 15% threshold, because AOC is going to get the progressive vote here. But Newsom and Harris, I think they get some congressional district delegates. I'm going to give a few of those out to them. You can see Harris doing well in the Detroit congressional district, doing well in some urban areas, and Newsom maybe doing better in the rural parts of Michigan, winning some delegates out there. But these remaining 12 delegates, let's split them evenly between the remaining candidates. Yeah. Okay, so I think Whitmer would drop out at this point. She didn't win our home state. There's no point in staying. And I also think Shapiro would drop out. He did disappointingly in the Michigan primary, not even getting a delegate. So I think Shapiro would look at the race. Not sure. He would probably look at who's the most moderate in the race in terms of an endorsement. He could endorse Pete Buttigieg. He could endorse Newsom. It's either one of those two candidates he would go ahead and back. But whoever appears more moderate to him, I think he would probably lean towards endorsing Pete Buttigieg, honestly. He would probably try to take the moderate late in the race. So yeah, I think Shapiro would go with Pete as an endorsement. And Whitmer, with her losing the Michigan primary, I'm not really sure who she would endorse either. But maybe she would endorse Pete because he won the statewide primary in Michigan. I don't know. I think I'd leave her endorsement a bit open-ended. But now we head into Super Tuesday, which has a bunch of states voting. It's a 4-candidate race at this point, so let's get into it. Starting off Vermont, this is an easy win for AOC. Pete Buttigieg would definitely come in second in this contest. I think only one more candidate. Actually, all three of them could potentially qualify here. I think they would all kind of qualify in this contest. I think they'll all hit at least 15% because there's only 4 candidates here. In Massachusetts, this is another one of those states where I think all 4 could really qualify for delegates. I think Pete Buttigieg again would get second in this contest. AOC would get first. Newsom, I think he pulls off third in this race, while Harris finishes in fourth place. Maine, I think this is a state that's going to Pete Buttigieg. He does well in the white rural states, so that's why I have him as a favorite in Maine. I think AOC gets second, Newsom gets third, Harris gets fourth. Then we head over to Minnesota and Iowa. Iowa, Pete Buttigieg, it was pretty much a tie last time in 2020. Honestly, you don't really know who really won that contest because the statewide delegate margin was so slim that a recount could just change it. So it was pretty much a tie last time. Pete Buttigieg nearly won it, or you could argue he narrowly won it. You kind of argue either way. He didn't win the popular vote in Iowa. He just won based off having one more statewide delegate against Sanders. But in Iowa, I think he would be the favorite to carry the state. AOC would make it close, but I think Pete Buttigieg would have the edge here. Newsom, I think, would get third, and Harris would get fourth. Minnesota, I think this is going to be an AOC state, but again, I think Pete Buttigieg would have a really good shot at winning this state. It's a more whiter state. But I think AOC would have the advantage here. I think a lot of Arab voters would go behind her, so she would win in the urban centers in Minnesota. Newsom probably would get third place here, and Harris would get fourth. Let's head down to the southern states. Alabama, this is for sure going towards Kamala Harris. She's going to do great with African American voters. I don't see Newsom getting that good margins out of them, but I think he would get second, probably with around 20% of the vote. AOC would get enough to at least get over 15%. These remaining delegates kind of be split. Okay. Virginia, I think Harris would win this state. Again, I think she would do well with black voters. These are one of her stronghold states. I think Pete Buttigieg would do well in Northern Virginia, getting some delegates out of there. AOC and Newsom. AOC would probably be one of her weaker states, but I still think she would get over 15%. Newsom, I think he gets third. North Carolina, I think, again, Kamala Harris is going to do well with black voters, so she's going to do well in this state too. We could take a look at North Carolina statewide polling, but I think it's a bit inaccurate because it doesn't have Harris leading in the state. It has her in second, but I really doubt that. I think she would just win it. But again, Pete Buttigieg would perform decent in the state according to polls. Newsom would probably get third place, and AOC barely gets to 15% there. But Tennessee, Arkansas, Oklahoma, these are whiter states, so I could see Newsom doing a lot better in these states. I think he'd be the favorite in a few of them. We'll start off with Tennessee. I think this is going to be a Gavin Newsom state. Harris would probably get second here. There's some black voters in Tennessee, so she would do decent here. She has an electorate that's leaning towards her in the state. I think Pete Buttigieg would also do well in Tennessee. Well, AOC, I think, would probably get fourth place in this state. Arkansas, I think this is going to be another Pete Buttigieg state. I think he could do pretty well in this whiter state, so I have him as a favorite to win it. I think Newsom would come in second. Harris would come in fourth place, and Harris would come in third, and AOC would come in fourth. In Oklahoma, this is another whiter state, so I have Newsom carrying the state while Pete Buttigieg is in a close second. AOC, I think, would actually get third in this state. And I think we'll probably see Harris not even get to 15%. I think she'd only get 13% of the vote. I'll have her have one delegate out of Oklahoma. Maybe she gets some delegates out of a congressional district. So I'll give her about 2. And then we'll split evenly the remaining congressional, or not the congressional, the rest of the delegates there. Texas. So Pete Buttigieg is actually narrowly leading the polls In Texas, I doubt that. I think Newsom's going to beat him out here. But let's just get into it. I think Harris actually gets second in the state, and Pete Buttigieg gets third. Again, Pete Buttigieg, he doesn't poll well with minority voters. And Texas is a much more diverse state than a state like Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Tennessee. There's a lot of black voters in this state as well, which is why I have Harris doing good here. But I still think Newsom would actually beat out Harris in this state. AOC I actually think does a little bit better than Pete Buttigieg here because of Latino voters going her way. Then we have Colorado and Utah. These are progressive leaning states. Sanders won them back in 2020's primary. So in Colorado, I think there'd just be pretty strong AOC state. Second would go to Pete Buttigieg. I think he would do well in this state. Gavin Newsom, I think he gets third here, and Harris gets enough delegates for statewide delegates. Utah, this is going to be another strong state for AOC. Newsom, I think he gets about third. I think Pete Buttigieg would do well in this white rural state. Harris just gets enough statewide delegates there. Then we head over to California, the biggest electoral prize. And let's just take a look at polling out of California. So Gavin Newsom obviously has a pretty big lead, but this is Harris's home state, so she'll definitely do better than Pete Buttigieg here, but I don't think she would carry her state, because Gavin Newsom is a well-approved governor in California, and that's definitely going to have a lot more sway than Harris being a vice president and a former senator from California. So I have Newsom winning the state of California with around 36% of the vote. Harris, I think she gets around 27% of the vote. AOC, I think, actually does better than Pete Buttigieg. She'd do better with Latino voters here. And Pete Buttigieg gets 15% out of California. So this is the results of Super Tuesday. I think all the candidates are going to stay in. Pete Buttigieg won 3 states. AOC won 5 states. Newsom won 4. And Harris won 3 states. So this is very much up for grabs as primary, but Newsom is the narrow frontrunner, while Harris is in second. So let's get over to the next few states, but we forgot about American Samoa, which typically votes with Super Tuesday. It's random who wins this, but I think Newsom would carry it. All right, now let's head to the next few states. So it's usually Georgia, Mississippi, Missouri, North Dakota, Idaho, Washington, Hawaii that kind of vote in this bunch here. So in Georgia, Harris is going to do well with black voters, so I see her carrying the state of Georgia. Pete Buttigieg, he's not going to do well with black voters. I don't even think he would get 15% in the state either. I think Newsom's going to get second here. And AOC will get third. The rest of these delegates are kind of split even between these two candidates. Mississippi, Harris is going to do extremely well in Mississippi, winning a ton of delegates here. Newsom, I think he gets some delegates out of this state. AOC gets some delegates too. Then we head to Missouri. This is going to be a Pete Buttigieg state. It's bordering Iowa and Arkansas. Typically, these states kind of really vote together. They're kind of in a similar geographic position. So in Missouri, I think Pete Buttigieg narrowly beats Harris for this state. I think Harris would have a chance. He would do well in St. Louis because there's a lot of black voters there. So you definitely get pretty good margins in the urban centers out of Missouri. But I still think she loses it to Pete Buttigieg since it's still a pretty white state overall in the electorate. And I think the other two candidates here would at least get 15% of the vote. So we have North Dakota. This is a more progressive-leaning state in Democratic primaries. So I have AOC winning it. And the rest of these candidates will get some delegates out of it. I'm not even sure if Harris would get over 15% in this state. So yeah, that's how I'd put the delegates there. Idaho. This is a more progressive-leaning state, but Biden did win it in 2020. So Newsom could carry it, or even Pete Buttigieg could carry the state. So it's really up for grabs between AOC, Pete, and Newsom. But I'm just going to say the progressive base is less splintered than the establishment is in this scenario. So I have AOC winning this state while Pete Buttigieg gets second. Newsom gets third here, and Harris probably gets fourth. Washington State, I think AOC would definitely carry the state again. Same reasoning as Idaho. The establishment's kind of a little bit splintered here. Then Harris might not even get over 15% in this state. Let's see. Kind of looking at these totals, I think she would get at least 15%. Okay. Now we get to Florida, Ohio, Illinois, Kansas, and Arizona. So in Florida, I think Harris would be the leader here. We could take a look at Florida statewide polls, and we do have Ohio polls as well. But in Florida, Pete Buttigieg actually has a pretty good lead, but this is excluding Harris from the polling average. So, again, not really that helpful for us. Ohio, on the other hand, Harris would do poorly here. She's already in fifth in statewide polling here, a poll actually including her, so she wouldn't win Ohio. But I do think she would win Florida. It's a southern state. It seems to be kind of her base in this primary. A lot of black voters in Florida, but there's a lot of Latino voters here too, so I could see AOC doing decent here. But again, there's a lot of Cuban voters in Florida as well, and Cubans last time didn't really like progressive candidates, so maybe AOC doesn't get second in this state. But I think Harris gets first. Newsom probably gets second. AOC probably gets third, and Pete Buttigieg probably gets fourth. In Ohio, Gavin Newsom has a lead here, so it's a pretty strong lead of 5 points, so I think he gets first place in this state. Did they include AOC in this poll? They actually did. Okay, so AOC probably gets third in the state while Pete Buttigieg gets second. And I think Harris at least gets 16% of the vote because there's some black voters in Ohio in the urban center, so she would get some votes out of them. In Illinois, just based off how Harris didn't do that well in Illinois or back in Ohio, and in 2024, she didn't even do that well in Illinois. She only won it by 11 points. I think she would kind of be possibly even in third place in this state. So I think Newsom would win it, similar to why he won Ohio. He seems like he's polling well in the Rust Belt states so far. So I think he would carry Illinois. I think AOC would probably get second place here. Could see her doing well with Latino voters in this state. Harris likely gets third here. She would have some support with black voters. And Pete Buttigieg barely gets to 15 points. And Kansas, it's really between Pete Buttigieg and Newsom. I think AOC actually wouldn't win this state. But I think Newsom actually pulls off the victory against Pete Buttigieg here. While AOC finishes in third, Harris doesn't get enough support for 15% of the delegates, but I think she carries one delegate out of a congressional district here. In Arizona, let's take a look. It's a closed primary state, so that's not really good for AOC. Progressives kind of rely on independents and Democratic primaries to do well. But I think Newsom would get the victory here in Arizona, while AOC gets second. Pete Buttigieg and Harris. I think Harris actually gets a bit more support than Pete Buttigieg does in Arizona. Okay, and with these remaining states, we're just going to go from the west to the east, and we're no real order. I think all four of these candidates stay in the race. You could look at their delegate totals. I think they're going to probably hope for a contested convention and make a deal to crown a new nominee. So let's start off with Hawaii and Alaska. I think Hawaii goes to AOC here. She wins it by a strong margin. Newsom probably gets second here. In Alaska, I think Newsom gets first place. AOC gets third. I think Pete Buttigieg actually gets second here, and I don't think Harris does well in Alaska. So let's head over to Democrats abroad. This is more progressive leaning. Newsom would get some votes. Pete Buttigieg would get some votes, but I don't think Harris cracks 15% in Democrats abroad. This territory, it went to Bernie Sanders last time with a really low turnout, but it's a very low turnout territory, so it's kind of unpredictable. Guam, I think AOC would actually carry Guam. Virgin Islands, it's a very rich territory. I think Newsom would win it. In Puerto Rico, I think this goes to AOC by a predominant way. And I think Newsom probably gets second here, and I don't think Pete Buttigieg gets any delegates out of Puerto Rico. Oregon, I think it goes to AOC, but Newsom would be in a close second. I actually think Harris gets some delegates out of here, and I think Pete Buttigieg misses out on 15%. Montana, it's a whiter state, so I could see Pete Buttigieg winning here. And it's a more rural state as well, so I think he has a leg up over Newsom here. Again, I don't think Harris gets 15% in this state. I don't think she would perform that well. It's such a rural state. Wyoming, it's an older state. It's also really rural. But I could see Newsom beating out Pete Buttigieg here. It's really between those two when it comes to these more whiter rural states. Again, I don't think Harris cracks 15%. In South Dakota, I think AOC probably gets about third here. It's between Gavin Newsom and Pete Buttigieg, but I would give it to Newsom narrowly. Nebraska I'd also give to Newsom. Well, Harris or AOC gets third, and Harris doesn't get any delegates. New Mexico, it's a closed primary, but I think AOC would do well with Latino voters in this state, so I think she would win it. Newsom gets second. And then I think Harris would get 15%, while Pete Buttigieg gets 13%. Louisiana, this is going to be a very strong Harris state. She does well with black voters. AOC barely gets to 15%. Newsom gets a few more delegates, but Pete Buttigieg gets 0. Wisconsin. Judging by how Newsom did in Illinois and Ohio, I see this being a state that goes towards him. It's really any of these four candidates could really win this state, so everyone's kind of in it. It's going to be like a very close four-way battle here. You can see Harris doing well with black voters in this state. AOC, I think, would probably get third. Pete Buttigieg gets fourth. Indiana, this what used to be Pete Buttigieg's home state, so I have him actually winning Indiana against Gavin Newsom. Again, I don't think Harris actually gets 15% here, but I think she gets some delegates out of the state. There we go. Kentucky, I think this is going towards Newsom. Pete Buttigieg probably gets second here. AOC third. Harris fourth. West Virginia, kind of a similar story. I think Newsom wins this state. I think AOC actually gets a bit more support than Pete Buttigieg does here. I don't think Harris gets over 15%, so she's not getting any delegates out of West Virginia. Pennsylvania, I think, would actually go towards Newsom. Harris, I think, would get second. Pennsylvania does have a lot of population centers, so she would do well with a black vote in this state. AOC, I actually think, gets second in the state. Harris gets third. I could see a lot of progressives voting for AOC in this state. Pete Buttigieg, I don't think he gets 15%. Thinks he gets a few gets a few district delegates out of the state. Maryland is a very strong Harris state. A lot of black voters in this state. She's definitely going to do well here. Newsom gets second. AOC gets at least to 15%, and I think Pete Buttigieg only gets like one delegate out of this. He's not going to do well with black voters. He's doing pretty badly with them in polling early on. Delaware, it's an establishment state. I think Newsom actually has this. Harris gets second here. AOC gets third, and Pete Buttigieg gets fourth. DC, Harris is definitely going to carry the District of Columbia. And I don't think Pete Buttigieg gets any delegates out of DC. New Jersey, a very establishment state. I see Newsom actually winning it. I think all four candidates at least get some delegates out of New Jersey. New York, it's AOC's home state. She's going to do very well here. So I think that she wins like 42% of the votes. Seems about right for her home state. Newsom probably gets third. I think Harris actually gets second in New York. And honestly, I don't think Pete Buttigieg gets enough support to get over 15 points. I think he just gets it shy at around 13% support. But I think he gets some district delegates out of New York. The rest of these candidates each going to get the rest of the statewide delegates here. Then we have Connecticut and Rhode Island up next. Connecticut, with the race kind of, again, the progressives only have one candidate in this race, so with a lot of vote splitting, I could see AOC just winning with like around a third of the vote. Rhode Island's a bit more left-leaning than Connecticut is, so I think she does a bit better here. Harris misses out. She only gets 14% support, so the rest of these delegates get divided up. So this is how the 2020 Democratic primary looks like at the end after all the pledged delegates are done. So really it goes to a contested convention at this point. Really any candidate, well, I don't think AOC is going to emerge as the winner in this. I think it's more likely that she's going to try to persuade either Harris or Newsom to pick a progressive vice presidential nominee. I think Newsom's most likely going to be the candidate. He has the most pledged delegates. He has 150 more delegates than AOC, and 125. But he's still going to be pretty much a front runner here, and I think AOC is probably going to make him pick a progressive for his vice presidential choice. I don't think Harris is going to get it. She has the third place support, so I don't see her making that much of a margin. I think Pete Buttigieg is pretty much out of it, considering he's only at 656 delegates, so even if he gets his support to go to Newsom, that's not enough for a majority of pledged delegates. And if they don't get the majority of the votes in terms of pledged delegates here, then it's going to, super delegates are going to come in. But overall, I think Newsom's the winner in this scenario. Other than that, thanks so much for watching this video. If you're new to this channel, you should definitely consider subscribing. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you all in the next one.